Exploring theology, doctrine, and all of the fascinating subjects in between, broadcasting from an undisclosed location, Dead Men Walking starts
now.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Dead Men Walking podcast. Thanks for coming along on the ride. Thanks for sharing with a friend. All glory to God. Check out DMWpodcast.com. You can find out more about the show and our snarky t-shirts, and you can support the show if you buy something there, so we appreciate it. Usually I ramble on a bit, but if you're watching, you see that I have another body in the studio with me here, which we usually do a lot of our stuff over Zoom. If we can have a guest in studio, we absolutely love it. It's Blake Callens.
How you doing?
How are you, man?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Full disclosure, Blake is family's, my cousin's husband. We've been talking back and forth on text and, Twitter and all the places that you can. Isn't it crazy? You can connect like 17 different ways now.
Really is, dude.
Especially when I talk to a client, I'm like, do I text you? Do I Facebook message you? Do I DM you?
Signal.
Do I signal? But there's so many ways to connect. But we've been talking and, had some really interesting conversations. I know that you're researching for a book that you're writing right now. Do you have a title yet?
It has a working title. I just finished it.
You want to share it, or can you share it or no?
The working title is The Case Against the Case for Christian Nationalism.
Interesting. So this is going to be a fun episode for a lot of the listeners, too, because we've had some Christian nationalists, pro-Christian nationalist people on, or just people who wanted to try to explain it, like Joel Webbin's been on talking about it. Joseph Spurgeon's been on talking about it. I know who else. We had AD on. Who you've had interaction with back and forth on Twitter. So I think this is going to be a new perspective. Not that they all lined up, but they were all pretty much pro. And I'm not saying you're necessarily con, but I think you want to get into really the undertones of the movement, kind of the minutia and the mud that no one else really gets into. You really like get down in there and you're seeing where the connections and what are the motivations and things like that. And I thought it'd be interesting to have you on. You just happen to be up from South Carolina, because you went from North to South Carolina, right?
I escaped.
So you were one of them Carolina boys down there, up back but you didn't grow up down there.
No, I grew up in L.A. Hollywood, dude.
Hollywood. Wait a minute, did we just think of a new nickname for you? Is your name just not Hollywood now?
What's
up, Hollywood?
As long as it's more like Hollywood Hulk Hogan, I'm probably okay.
Yeah, that's our man. I need my. I should have armed my pad here. We got all kinds of drops. I don't know. We're gonna have to use one on you. Well, I don't have them in there, but so I thought we'd just have a conversation, man.
Yeah, dude. Because
you're in town. Your family, we talk about this stuff all the time. I know you and I are trading sources back and forth for theology and stuff like that. Yeah. I really appreciate you. So first of all, tell me a little bit about the research you're doing on your book.
Yeah.
Do you expect that out, next year, you think, maybe?
I don't know, man.
You don't know?
I mean, I've never written a book.
Get right up on that mic for me, too, so we want to be able to hear you.
Right on it, I'll eat it.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so, the research, really, I have kind of always been a history nut.
Okay.
And when I got out of the Army, started going back to school in the GI Bill, I thought for a while, like, maybe I want to be a history professor. And I dropped that real quick to be a software engineer, and that's what I've been doing for 15 years. But I just keep reading history books all the time. And then about, 8 years ago, about 2015 or so, I started reading about the history and philosophy and of totalitarianism. I really got into it. I think I got into it with what everybody else gets into it with, which is the Gulag Archipelago.
Okay.
And then, I kind of just kept going with that, mostly focused on left-wing stuff of it,
Okay.
At least at first. Read about maybe like 5 books a year on the subject, but it became my main history interest. And then 2020 happened.
Okay, yeah.
And
what happened in 2020?
Wait, what? So, my interest in the subject grew exponentially.
Okay, yeah. Did you start to see some of those streams of the stuff you've been studying kind of take place?
And that's
like
when
tactics, kind of?
Absolutely. I mean, when you looked at the way that COVID was handled.
Yeah.
Right? The second they started saying we're going to do vaccines passes, the first thing that comes in my head is Gesundheitspass. Right? Oh, you're going to Germany 1934 me. Okay, yeah, I see what we're doing.
Right.
And so I started writing about that quite a bit. Most of the stuff that, even though what I'm writing about now.
Where are you putting it out at? You got a website or Substack, or what do you do?
I do. I have two. The one for the Christian nationalism stuff, which I think most people are going to be interested in, is christiannationalismnotes.com.
Okay.
And then I have another one that I don't know why I named it, but I named it On Peaceful Noncompliance.
Okay.
.substack.com. And that's where like most of my earlier writings, which you're going to see, COVID was more of a left-wing authoritarian thing.
Okay.
At least in the way most folks tried to handle it. And I've written extensively about that while that was going down. And especially while the mandates were coming down, how similar that was to.
That's pretty crazy. The subject you're really interested in, you see almost a once in a lifetime situation where it really kind of plays out to where you can study it, see reactions, see tactics.
The one that blew my mind, right, in that sense was, there's something called the Milgram experiment.
I'm not familiar.
Okay. This is really interesting. So early 60s, they decide they want to study why did people go along with the Nazis. And so they do this experiment where a guy comes in to a room with a doctor, and he's put in front of a series of dials, and he's talking to somebody on a microphone that he can't see.
Okay.
And the whole thing is the doctor's going to ask, or actually I think the person asks the person that he can't see a question, and if the answer is wrong, he's supposed to give the guy an electric shock.
Okay.
And the doctor says what the voltage of the shock is as it goes up.
Okay.
And
is the person he giving a shock to in the room with him?
No, he can't see him, and it's just by audio.
Okay.
And the voltage keeps going up and up and up, and there's areas in this dial that clearly mark, this is dangerous. Don't do this. And the thing is, the person with the dial is told the experiment is how the effect of these shocks and stress will change the way they answer. But really, that's not the experiment.
I think I have heard of this. And they're saying how far that person will go from an authority figure to possible harm or death of the person, fictitious person on the other side of the dial.
Yeah. And the conclusion was 2/3 of people will basically do whatever a person in authority tells them to do.
That is nuts. Now, here's the thing. I always think because I have a real problem with authority. The Lord's working with me on it, as I jokingly say. I got a rebellious streak. Sometimes it is good to defy tyrants and obey God. Other times it is good to submit and understand submission. I had a real problem with COVID for those kind of authoritarian reasons. And I would always like to think, well, I'm one of those people I think that would stand up. But I've looked back in my life, and there's been certain times where I probably have done something that was maybe against my moral principle or principles or morals, because there was not only authority, but maybe there was a pressure because there was multiple people of authority there, and I was in the minority. Not very many times. But my point of saying that is 2/3 of people, I mean, that is a huge subset. That's the majority. It's 66% of people, if you're an authority figure, will do it. And we saw that kind of play out. I mean, I saw COVID take what I thought were sane people and turn them almost insane with, you have to do this, you're going to kill people, and you're like, well, hold on. I mean, have you read the data and the science behind it and things like that? So I think we saw that experiment kind of play out firsthand in COVID, not only in the United States, but globally.
We did. And, I wrote a piece on the weirdly named Substack that was about that happening in my town, because we lived in the town that I think has the fourth highest amount per capita of people with PhDs.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, it's kind of like the Silicon Valley of the South. Me being a software guy, when we moved there a long time ago, that was the place to be. Now I can be anywhere.
Yeah.
And, based off of people I talked to, it was kind of known that it wasn't about the vaccine for me.
Yeah.
Right. It was about, I'm not going to give you my medical information. And really, the stand that I decided to take, and I lost my job over it because I was working for a federal contractor at the time.
Wow.
Or a company that had federal contracts. It wasn't a direct
Right.
federal contractor. And that was a do not pass go, do not collect $200, no testing option. You're going to,
Get
do
it.
it.
Yeah.
But I could have filed for the religious exemption, right? And would have gotten it. But my thought process was, if I do that,
Yeah.
by proxy, I am condoning the stripping of the rights of consent from people who are not believers.
Right.
And I could not say, hey, I'm a follower of Christ that went along with that.
Yeah.
And
You're looking at it in the broader sense of just the actual act of taking someone's rights away was immoral.
it was a crazy time. I mean,
Yeah.
November of 2021, Noam Chomsky was saying, you should kick all the vaccinated out of society, and finding food is their problem.
Yeah.
Jacinda Ardern,
Yeah.
former
The poster
president.
child of the leftist hippie, and
Oh my
yet
gosh.
he wants to,
Yeah. Well, she former, I don't know if she's finally out, but she's not running again. The Prime Minister of New Zealand,
okay.
who was the former president of the International Socialist Youth, is on camera saying, I'm going to create a two-tier society. It was a crazy time, and people
really
kind of
was.
lost their minds.
It really was. And here's the thing that really bothers me is everyone who kind of stood up, it sounds like you and I and other people who just said, nah, we're not going to go along with the clown show. I found most of those people, not all of them, but most of them in our ilk pretty reasonable. I was just having a discussion with Jennifer, your wife, and a couple days ago and said, I was pretty, no, I wasn't wearing a mask in my car by myself. I wasn't going to take your vaccine. But before COVID, it was like you had cough or you felt weird. We didn't go to grandma's house. We warned other people. We were generally, hey, let's be, cognizant of other people when we're sick and try not to spread. So it was this weird thing where most people were like that, but then they were almost being ostracized and put into this thing of like, oh, they're just these crazy people that don't care if they kill people with their virus and this. And what really irked me was even after we had hard data. I'm a data guy. You're probably a data guy. You
Very much.
Right?
I happened to write a piece of software that went through the VAERS database.
Well, there you go. Even after we had that hard data, I mean, that was 9 months after, not only on the vaccine, but I'm just saying in general what the COVID, SARS, family of this virus did. We still pushed forward with a very specific narrative that was anti-data, and I just went, you just stand there and you go, am I crazy? Am I a crazy person? Why is the majority of the globe jumping on this, and something that seems so data-wise felt so plain and out in the open, and we're doing the exact opposite. I mean, it's almost like the whole world got mob mentality. It's like I don't know it, or maybe you can explain it as someone who studies, authoritarianism and things like that. Is that a tactic, or is that part of it where once some people get on board, then it's like everyone just kind of follows and falls,
There is the Milgram experiment aspect of it.
Yeah.
I think what I saw and what really, really shook me was, the highly educated town I lived in was very agnostic atheist. And I saw the existential dread take over people who had no belief that there was anything else.
Yeah.
Right. And if your whole existence is maximizing your life, and that's the majority of the world, right?
Yeah. Very true.
And that idea of like, oh, you got to think about like March 2020, we got these videos of people collapsing in the street in China, right?
Right.
I think so much of that was just driven by like, if I catch this thing and I just happen to be the statistic, poof, I'm gone.
Yeah.
Nothing. And I think that took over, a lot of people's minds. Even some Christians' minds,
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we weren't going to make this a COVID episode, but I think there's some parallels here, what we're talking about too, of like kind of falling in line, maybe not quite understanding definitionally what it is that we're following.
Yeah.
Because I'm not all in on Christian nationalism. And here's the thing. It's so tough for me because there's like 10 different definitions of Christian nationalism. And I know some groups are trying to define it and say, here's the, you got the G3 guys defining it. You got Joel Webbin and his guys kind of, saying, no, this is what it is. You've got the secular leftist version of it. You got the far right version of it. So even when I say that, it's like when I say evangelical, like what does that even mean anymore?
For sure.
It's such a wide variety of definitions underneath that. But I mean, I've said before, I'm Presbyterian in my denomination. I'm Reformed in my faith. I hold to the Westminster. I'm probably a general equity guy. And, it clearly says not every law is for the new covenant. But we will take the general equity from it thereof and use it.
Yeah.
If there was an old, so I don't know if that relates to Christian nationalism in a authoritarian kind of, every single municipality, state, and federal government has to be Christian and function under the Mosaic law. I know this sounds like a non-answer when we're talking about Christian nationalism, but I go, man, the founding principles and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution is pretty darn close to what I say you could get to as a Christian nation that isn't implementing Mosaic law, but under a covenant of grace. That would be pretty close to that. Now, obviously, you'd have people, well, there was still slavery and there was still, women's suffrage. But I get that. I'm saying we've made some strides towards that. But I'm saying that what it said in word in the founding documents was pretty darn close. And people go, oh, it's a cop-out. You just sound like one of those 1776 conservatives, let's go back to the founding fathers. I'm saying I think the founding documents could be explored a little bit differently than we've explored them. We've had, huge federal expansions and all this stuff that's really harmed kind of the uniqueness of the Constitution. But that's where I'm at right now. Where are you at on the Christian nationalist movement? So the listeners can kind of understand where you're coming from.
So, well, first, you got to separate what you talked about, which has kind of a theonomy side to it.
Yeah.
And even what like the G3 guys are doing, and even I would say even what like Joel Webbin's talking about, you have to put Stephen Wolfe's theory like way out here.
Okay.
It's something completely different, right?
Okay.
Stephen Wolfe is not he's not a theologian.
Yeah.
He's a political theorist. He has a PhD in political theory. He wrote a book of political theory.
Which I think confused a lot of people because he was published under Canon Press with the Doug Wilson guys and the theonomy thought and the general equity thing. And it was like, oh, here, this is something we kind of promote and endorse. And I think that's what, I'm just interjecting, but keep going with your thought. But it was confusing because it's like, oh, so this is kind of what Doug must be talking about, or this is what,
And the people that reviewed it, I mean, the reason I'm sitting here with you, I don't want to be here. Like, I never wanted to write this book. I mean, I do. I love seeing you. But, like,
I don't want to.
But, like, I didn't want to write this book.
Yeah.
Right? But the reviewers, they didn't get that either. And they're reviewing, Stephen Wolfe's book starts out with this kind of weird, unscriptural, if you ask me.
Okay.
I'm not a theologian, but I've run it by some. And actually, that's what the theologians focused on in the reviews, this theory of...
You don't have to be a theologian to know if something's unscriptural, though. I mean, that's a logical fallacy, right? It's an argument from authority.
You're very right about that.
I hate that stuff where it's like, well, you're not a... Well, look, I can read.
Fair. And actually, I have described his theory to people who don't even really think about it. And they're like, wait, how would that work? It's that kind of broken.
Right.
His pre-fall, prelapsarian theory on how man, if Adam had never taken of the fruit, would repopulate the earth and they would have distinct ethnicities that would potentially war against each other. And it's like, well, if I hold hate for another person in my heart, that's a sin, and therefore we're not prelapsarian anymore?
Right.
Right? So it doesn't really work in that sense, and that's what guys like Kevin DeYoung point out, right? But if you read his book, and if for me, it just set off alarm bells in my head because it's just littered with classic authoritarian and ethno-nationalist talking points, and he does a good job of sprinkling them about and kind of maybe sometimes slightly obfuscating them. Some of them are just dead in there.
Yeah.
That if somebody like a Neil Shimby, who, like me, STEM guy, but he's really read up on critical theory, reads a book, a woke church book, he's going to know the lingo. He's going to pick up on things. And that's what Stephen Wolfe's book did for me for right-wing authoritarian nationalism.
Okay.
It's like it's all in there, and if you don't know it and you don't study it, you don't necessarily pick up on it. And so I like to say that Stephen Wolfe's book it's not a Christian book. It is a book of mostly secular styled authoritarian and ethno-nationalism, very early 20th century style and ideas, wrapped in Calvin's Two Kingdoms theology, so that it could be laundered to a Christian audience.
What are some things, and I don't want to go into a full review of his book, but what are some of the things in there off the top of your head that if you could remember, some things where you see authoritarianism or that secular authoritarianism kind of taking hold in the book?
The big one, right at the top of the book, is how he defines nationalism.
Okay.
Right? The first thing he says is nationalism, and then he builds onto it to Christian nationalism. There's a phrase. It's a totality of national action. Now, if you study totalitarianism, the word total, any derivative of the word total, sticks in your mind. And the first person to use the word totalitarian was Mussolini in a positive context. Okay, the Italian fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentile used the word total throughout his writings specifically to convey this, what we think of a totalitarian, this entire overarching government running everything, what Mussolini would say, everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. And so he starts with that. So the first time somebody says, my definition of nationalism is a totality of national action, alarm bells are going to go off in my head. And then in that area, he comes around and he says, this totality of national action creates a redundant web of obligations that orders everything to the national good. That is the textbook definition of fascism. I know that's a word that has become practically useless in our society, but it has a definition.
Right.
And the definition of fascism is this. We think about our liberal democracy.
Okay.
The liberal democracy is the society for the individual, the sovereignty of the individual. We would prefer 100 guilty men go free so that one innocent man doesn't spend his life in prison.
Right.
And fascism, by its core definition, inverts that relationship and says, it's not society for the individual, it's the individual for society, it's right-wing collectivism, everything goes up, and you are part of this collective, and everything you do must be ordered to the ultimate national good, which is everything that we put our effort into.
Sure.
And I mean, it's not even obfuscated. Like, that is, a lot of people don't necessarily get that because we don't talk about what the definition of fascism is.
Yeah.
Just a little anecdote was like, I was talking with Chris Roseborough on Twitter, Fighting for the Faith, who does study fascism. I was surprised to learn, happy to learn. And we were talking about it, I was talking about, like, oh yeah, here's what Stephen Wolfe says. And his response was, oh yeah, that's fascism.
Right.
That very section I just talked about.
Yeah.
It's that straightforward. But most people don't, I think you think of like the Big Lebowski and he throws the mug at the cop and goes, you fascist. That's what most people think fascism means.
Right. Or I've heard it so overused on the left of everything. You know, someone who says who's pro-life or an abolitionist, you fascist, and you go, what? How do we connect the two?
It's somebody who's doing something I don't like.
So what's your definition of nationalism? Let's take Christian out of it. What's the correct idea if we're just thinking of secular nationalism, and then we'll throw the adjective in front of it, Christian. So is nationalism is it patriotic? Is it like a thought? Is it a feeling? Is it a movement? Like, I'm really asking because I've heard so many definitions of it, and I'm not really sure. When someone says nationalism, is it close to fascism? Because it sounds like it is.
It is. I mean, it depends on whether you want to take it down to the definition of what is a nation state, right?
Okay.
And so is it a collective of people, whether under, as Stephen Wolfe would argue, all the best governments are, based off of a common ethnicity and we're kind of like a tribal people that has grown into a larger nation? Or is it like our nation is more based upon a nation of ideals?
Right.
There's a unifying common factor amongst a people that makes them decide that we are going to be a collective under this banner.
Yeah. Throughout history, it usually was the ethnicity of the people, though, wasn't it? That's usually what did create nations. And like you said, we're a nation of ideals, more melting pot. So is nationalism just pride in that tribe, in that national tribe? Like that's what I'm trying to get to.
Nationalism, yeah.
You know?
I mean, I don't think it has to be.
No.
I mean, I think that's maybe more of a byproduct.
Yeah.
Right, than the core of it.
Yeah.
I think the core of nationalism is we want to come together under this collective banner. You can have nationalism for a city-state.
Right.
Right. It doesn't have to be a giant country like ours. It doesn't have to be a federal system like ours.
Yeah.
It is at its core, is believing, counter it to anarchy.
Yeah.
Right. It is the idea that we're going to come together, have a system that is our collective, whatever our collective identity is, whether it be our ethnicity or our ideals.
Yeah. So, really quick, just to go back before we go forward again. So where are you on Christian nationalism in general? As like I said, it's hard because you have a couple different definitions. It sounds like the Wolfe definition of Christian nationalism.
No.
It's a hard pass for Blake. Hard pass.
I mean, it's a hard pass for the Andrew Isker version too. It's not much better.
Okay.
And
that would be why, because we're seeing authoritarianism kind of inserted in that underlying of fascism, you're saying? Or do you think there's ethnic reasons as well?
Theirs is explicitly ethno-nationalist as well, right?
Okay, so explain that for me and people listening. Ethno-nationalist.
So there's three things that we could talk about, right? There's white nationalism, there's ethno-nationalism, there's anti-Semitism, and they all don't have to be the same thing.
Okay.
Right? I can be a black anti-Semite. Right?
Okay, right.
I can be a black ethno-nationalist. Right? Okay. White nationalism is a very specific subset of ethno-nationalism, particularly characterized, well, you got to be white, otherwise it's not white nationalism.
Okay.
And then on top of that, most often, pretty much all the time, includes anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Right? So, but I prefer to use the word ethno-nationalism because, frankly, I try to use language that hasn't been ruined by the left.
Right.
Right. And like you go to Twitter and you see people like say the slightest thing and someone screaming white supremacist at them.
Right.
And so I don't want to use that language because if I start talking about white supremacy or white nationalism, even though it might be that legitimately.
You already have it in your mind of something because of the way it's been used the last 5 years. The
same reason I don't bring up the Nazis once in my book. I focus on Italy and Spain for fascism, and I focus on nativism and the Klan for ethno stuff.
Yeah.
And because nobody's going to listen if I start calling everybody a Nazi.
Yeah.
So ethno-nationalism is the term I like to use because it's kind of that, it fits. It just fits.
Okay.
And so for the...
But I mean, to me, that sounds like you're just saying a nation based on ethnicity.
You could.
And didn't we just say that most nations were based on that? That's how we kind of congregate.
That's not technically what the term would mean.
Okay.
It would mean, so like black Hebrew Israelites are ethno-nationalists.
Okay.
Right? Ethno-nationalism comes with a assumption of you believe you were superior.
Okay. All right.
Okay. As opposed to we are a nation of Germans and we have an ethnicity. You wouldn't say Germany is an ethno-state.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, no, I'm glad you made that clarification.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked me. So Torba and Isker, Torba being the owner of Gab.
Okay.
Isker being a pastor. He used to be a CREC pastor, I believe, and now I think he has an independent church.
Okay.
They co-wrote this book. It's about 60 pages of actual book long, called the Christian Nationalism, something about taking dominion and discipling nations.
Okay.
And their form of Christian Nationalism. First of all, that book, like I said, it's only 60 pages long and devotes an entire chapter to denouncing Talmudic Judaism. So if you've only given yourself 60 pages to describe your thesis and you give a whole chapter to that, we know where your priorities are.
Right.
So, and Torba is known for being, a hardcore anti-Semite. And a lot of people try to defend him. But it's, actually in the last day, Michael Young, Local Distance on Twitter, has been going at it with a lot of people, including Stephen Wolfe, about Torba's anti-Semitism and them defending it. They're openly defending it.
What kind of anti-Semitism stuff? Is it like statements against certain Jewish people? Or?
Yeah. One of the ones that actually Michael Young pulled out was Torba saying that negative stereotypical Jewish traits are part of their phenotype. Right? Okay. That's where we're getting, right? He's one of the ones that I always sticks with me is he says he's currently, today in 2023, fighting Judeo-Bolshevism.
What does that mean?
He means commies are Jews, and he's fighting them. It's really like, academic linguistic obfuscation of that.
Yeah, I don't know why is he linking those two?
Because he's an anti-Semite.
But I mean, there has to be a basis somewhere. Why are you linking communists and Jews?
So that's a long time.
Is that just?
That's a long time.
Is it okay? See, I just don't know that.
Yeah, because there were so many people in the original Bolshevik Revolution that were Jewish, and so it's just it's like Stephen Wolfe's podcast co-host who had a secret white nationalist account, which maybe we can get into.
Yeah.
Put out a whole thread where he said like all Antifa are Jews, right?
Okay.
It's this is when they're out in the areas, like I'm an old internet guy. I've been watching how white nationalists operate and ethno-nationalists, like real white nationalists on social media for years. And when they're out in the main spaces, there's there's lingos, there's code words, there's things like that. And when you get to their places where they feel they're safe, they just come right out with it.
Right.
Okay. So, and Torba's one of those guys that comes right out with it and then maybe we'll delete the tweet before he thinks he's going to get banned.
Right.
Right. And Isker on Twitter, who is 8th Century Wood Chipper on Twitter, if you are familiar with that count, he straight out came and said one of the main policy points, he said, of Christian nationalism should be, what was it exactly? I want to be accurate here. He said that stopping the demographic replacement of the majority demographic in America. He says when you bring that up, a lot of people in Christian nationalism bristle, and that's a bad thing. He's also said that, kind of alluded to, he was talking about training men, and he said, talked about turning young Christian men into stone cold killers. It's crazy stuff, man. These guys are cuckoo bananas.
So why do you think there is that vein of white supremacy, or as you're saying, what was the word?
Ethno-nationalism.
Ethno-nationalism.
Think white nationalism, but just say ethno.
Yeah, ethno-nationalism in the Christian nationalist movement. You think those guys were always there and they went, "Ooh, this is our time. Let's seize and we can advance stuff," or is it like, well, if there's going to be a national movement, we need to get on board with it, because that's our ultimate goal anyway. Or I don't know. I mean,
it's a yes and.
If you really read through the Bible, you can't really pull any type of white nationalism out of there. You really have to do some misinterpretations and bad hermeneutics when you're talking. It's a book full of Jewish people and Middle Eastern people. So why do you think there's that vein within it? Or I mean, are you throwing the baby out with the bathwater too? And you're like, any form of Christian nationalism can't be accomplished because we have these bad actors. Or where are you on that too?
Get back to the subject we were supposed to be talking about. Yeah, I think. Well, first of all, talk to a white nationalist, a non-supposed Christian with the Uganda flags in the bio on Twitter, and they'll tell you all why, the Bible's cool with white nationalism. They have their own set of eisegesis that they do for that. But as far as where I am with Christian nationalism, look, I'm a Christian, right?
Yeah.
So I would be a really bad Christian if I didn't think that my country's social mores should be ordered around Christian social mores, right?
Right.
But I firmly believe that is a product of the Great Commission. That is not a product of...
What's a product of the Great Commission?
Nations turning to God, or at least a majority of the nation turning to God.
Yeah.
And in a representative democracy, we would naturally get the voting power. Therefore, we would naturally start, orientating things that way. And what I think the New Testament is exceedingly clear about is that we are not to use violent methods to bring that about.
Sure.
A government, and I'm going to get a little more enlightenment here, but I agree with this. I think, enlightenment values at points can be natural law as well. And, a government is a collective individual in the legal sense.
Yeah.
And the moral sense. And if you're going to have a Christian nation, then a Christian nation must follow the same social mores as the individual Christian. And the individual Christian is told to leave blasphemers in peace, right?
Yeah.
The individual Christian is told not to use violence, but that our, words are our weapons, right?
Yeah.
That we destroy lofty arguments, right? It doesn't say, hey, when somebody says something bad about God, punch them in the face.
Right.
Right? And so if you're going to organize a nation as a Christian nation, you've got to follow the same rules. And like you were saying earlier, in the Greg Banson theonomy, the essence of even the civil law, the moral implications of that should bubble up into a Christian state law. Well,
yeah,
that is overruled, as we know, by changed rules in the New Covenant.
Right.
And one of those changed rules is leave blasphemers in peace.
Yeah.
Right. And so I know a lot of theonomists don't hold on to that, but I think that's a contradiction in their thought.
Right. Well, that's why I kind of look and say, okay, so this kind of libertarian system that really I don't think the founding documents of this country are really left or right. I think they're more libertarian than anything. Sure. I would say that's the closest I think you could come to a Christian nation, because if I'm living under a new covenant and I am to respect civil governments as Romans 13. Now, listen, that doesn't mean we roll over and we're a complete pacifist. We've had those episodes here, and I've talked about it at length.
I'm not a pacifist,
right? And there's a balance there, and we are to leave blasphemers at peace and things like that. I don't know how you can have an authoritarian Christian nationalist nation. That really starts to worry me, because we're getting into theocracy. We're getting into these crazy things that we have literally done in Christian history already. We've had crusades. We've had monarchies. I talked to some of these people that are proponents of a more authoritarian Christian nationalism, and I go, we fought a revolution because we essentially, I can't make direct comparison, but we had a state-ran religion, right? So I don't understand how it's being, because I think we're on the same page when I look at like fascism and that authoritarian type of installation of forced Christian values. And I say forced, that seems technically, if you make a law, it is technically forced if you don't agree with it. But at this, we all think murder's wrong, so we should have a law that says thou shalt not murder, right? But I'm saying that kind of authoritarian type of Christian nationalism, I would disagree with that. I think we're both on the same page there. I'm just kind of scratching my head going, how is this getting so much traction? Is it because the pendulum has swung so far, it feels like culturally we go, oh, we got to have a response. We got to take back I feel, okay, here's the thing. Sorry, I'm getting off subject here, but this is why I'm saying this real quick.
All right, man.
I feel like we have those, I feel like these movements always start with, we need to take back the country to the way it used to be. Every 30 years we have this. I mean, every 30 years, even through slavery, right, we got to take back. And it's like we use this excuse. I just did an episode with Bill Gothard and that whole situation. We used ATI curriculum in homeschooling, and he was this one guy who was very authoritarian, legalistic, and said, "Hey, it was the '80s." He's like, "I know how we can change the culture, man. We got it. Cabbage Patch dolls are from Satan. Drum music is from Satan. Rock music, all this stuff, and we've got to really hunker down. And I'm right, and I got all the answers. And I feel like we do this within the Christian realm. I feel like every 30 years, if not every 30 to 50 years, throughout history, there's always these things popping up where it's like the pendulum swing this way. You don't agree with the culture. Oh, we've got an extreme way to fix it. And it feels like some of these actors within the Christian nationalism stream are doing that. But is it that and something else too? There's always those bad actors
There's so much
where, like I said before, the question before of like, hey, let's take advantage of this and let's start our white nationalist kind of thought process through this stream of Christian nationalism. My point being is it's very frustrating when you have the far left and they're kind of authoritarian in some of the woke culture and the stuff that they're doing. And then you have like a guy like Torba who owns Gab, and he's like, "Hey man, freedom for all, and come over here and say what you want. We won't censor you like Twitter does." And then
he started drinking his old Kool-Aid of the people that came over.
And then you come along and you're like, well, there's a poop trail in that shrimp. You know what I'm saying? Like, why are you popping that in your mouth right now?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, there's some vestiges and holdovers of that. Like, I don't know. It's disheartening because I feel like I look at the landscape and you go, well, geez, who in the heck can you trust here when the Christian nationalist movement has felt like it's been, I don't know, it's been taken over by kind of white supremacy and basically making ethnicity like the ultimate thing. Yeah,
they've gotten really, by the way, like more overt with it in the last few weeks too. They're kind of like buying in, with American Reformer, right? Commissioning Stephen Wolfe to write an article.
Who runs American Reformer again? I can't. Do you know? Because I feel like I know the name.
It's Josh Abbotoy and Nate Fisher, right?
Okay.
You've talked to Fisher, right?
Yeah.
But they've and they also run New Founding, right?
Okay.
And you can kind of think of it's a crossover. I kind of think of these as you got two of the top same owners. It's basically the same org.
And what's your beef with them?
Oh. Well, I'll describe what they do. Okay, New Founding, which is really the core. Okay. New Founding is investment, and what they have done is they have positioned their investment around capitalizing upon the eventual collapse of the United States.
Okay.
They're pretty overt about it. Like, they were just yesterday calling for the balkanization of the United States.
Okay.
Right, like. Abbotoy has also some investments in real estate. Like they're building, subdivisions basically out in like small town America to get people to come out there with the idea of like, you're just a remote worker now, come live in the country.
Okay.
But it kind of plays into that whole thing of like, we're going to balkanize and we're going to move people to rule. Everything's kind of interconnected. American Reformer is, I think it's co-owned also, but at least directly involved it with Aaron Wren.
Okay.
Right. That's where he comes in play. And he's obviously long talked about like negative world and what's coming. So, and that same thing about like, I think he thinks the balkanization is coming, and he talks a lot about, Indiana. And I think that's where he's kind of set his flag for that maybe coming down. But American Reformer itself, and really, let's talk about Josh Abbotoy, who, by the way, I have to say hi to my best bud Josh, who confirmed my CIA connections. He announced on Twitter that he had confirmed that I am actually CIA connections. AD called me a Fed. Jeff Wright calls me a Fed.
You're working for all branches, man.
Josh goes all in and says he has confirmed my CIA connections.
How do you do that? Is that does he have your resume that you turned into the CIA, or like what does he?
I don't know. He must got the hookup, man. It's not my favorite one because Mike Cernovich called me a bug man once. So
I don't know what's a bug man. What does that mean?
It's a derogatory term for a urbanite liberal that lives like in New York, and it's like, no, dude, I'm a former airborne infantryman that lives in South Carolina,
right,
with guns.
On paper, you're NASCAR's number one fan. On paper,
I mean, yeah,
So anyway, New Reformer, what they were doing
They're
was
doing
what?
that. Josh Abbotoy, well, this is the thing. They are also coming out very, very hardcore authoritarian nationalism, right? Josh Abbotoy, I was having a back and forth with somebody else who was a fan of the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco.
Okay. We were just talking about him.
We were talking about him the other day. Not a good guy. And Josh Abbotoy, in response to that, got himself in some hot water by tweeting, in response to, because he had jumped into this thread, and then he tweeted out, America needs a Protestant Franco. Now, most people have no idea who Francisco Franco is, but when you're a nerd about totalitarianism like me, you do. So let me give you a quick idea of who Francisco Franco was and what these guys are pushing. And by the way, Fisher backed him up on that. Timon Klein backed him up on that. These are American Reformer guys. Francisco Franco, we'll just say the Spanish Civil War happened. He was the right-wing guy who built a right-wing coalition. He was a military guy, monarchist, allied himself with what we might call rad-trad Catholics and legit fascists, right? The Falangistas. And he was the commanding officer of the Spanish Foreign Legion in Morocco.
Okay.
So the right-wing side of the Civil War allies itself with Hitler and Mussolini. Hitler and Mussolini organize a Luftwaffe and Italian Air Force, I don't remember what they're called, airlift of Franco's army from Morocco into Spain.
Yeah.
He lets them have loose. And if you have kids in the car, earmuffs. He lets them rape and pillage. Sorry, that was a little too fast. He lets them literally rape and pillage Spanish towns. Lets word get out, uses that as a fear tactic. Okay?
Yeah.
When he takes over a town, he sieges a town and he finally takes it over. He takes any man that he even remotely thinks was loyal to his opposition or even friendly to his opposition, pulls them out into a field and mows them down with machine gun fire, thousands of people at a time. Okay? While that's happening, lets the soldiers have their way with the wives, the men he's murdering. It is estimated between 1936 and 1939, under his direct orders, roughly 200,000 people were extrajudicially murdered in this way. They are still to this day finding mass graves.
Right.
In the war, a lot of people say he stayed out of the war because he was smart. He was worn out because he just fought a 3-year civil war. Of course, he's not going to get into it in 39. He won his civil war in 39. When he won the civil war in 39, he made Catholicism the only religion legal to publicly practice in Spain. He couldn't really fight the war, but he sent the Falangistas, the legit fascists, to fight for the Nazis in Russia. Okay, so he was involved in the Axis side. This
guy sounds like a real jerk.
He sucked. Okay. Last piece, I'll tell you. When people say we need a Protestant Franco in America, this is what we're talking about. He kidnapped. He sent his opposition. You can tell this is the stuff I care about. He sent his opposition to concentration camps to work and die.
Okay.
Kidnapped their children and put them in loyalist homes to be educated as loyal Francoists.
Yeah.
It was called the White Terror. Right.
So let me ask you this. What if that tweet is just from a guy whose either intelligence level is so low that he's he's trying to say we need a Protestant that can handle business. And he's not saying, look, we need a Protestant that can go out there and rape people and kill people. I don't think that's what I don't know the person that you said that made this tweet. If you say we need a Protestant Franco, that'd be like someone saying we need a Christian Mussolini. I think that's a stupid comment.
It is.
But I would take that as them saying, oh, we need someone who can just take over everything for Christians. That's how I would read that tweet. So
Except he started talking about like why we need a Protestant Franco. And it was because he destroyed the commies. This is the common line, right, that you get from the authoritarians. He used the textbook reasoning on top of this, which is he wiped out the commies. The commies were murdering people too, which is true.
Yeah.
You know, two wrongs don't make a right. You ask me to choose between fascism and communism, and I say no.
The two rights make an airplane. Hey.
So,
I'm here for the dad jokes. Go ahead.
So anyway, this common line. This was also a Nazi line, by the way, right? The Nazis commissioned a guy named Adolf Erth to write books. He was a historian, to write books about how this isn't like when they took over in like 1933. Isn't it great we stopped the commies from taking over Germany, right? This is a common line from authoritarians on both ends. The communists and the fascists are each other's mortal enemy. And they spend most of their time trying to convince all of us in the middle that the other is an existential threat, right? So when he came back and was like, oh, well, yeah, he stopped the communists, which is the exact same line that the guy that I had been talking to previously was using, right? I'm like, then Charles Haywood jumps in, who has written extensively, glowingly, he wrote a glowing review in his own words, of Franco, right? These people know who they're talking about. They're not dumb.
Right.
Right.
So what do you attribute it to? I don't want to spend too much more time on this Twitter thread, but what do you attribute that to then? Yeah. In the sense of, do you think that person who tweets we need a Protestant Franco, who was it again? It was
Josh Abbotoy.
Josh Abbotoy, right? Are you saying he supports all the things that Franco supports secretly? Are we saying he's using a bad analogy for clicks? Are you saying, like, what are you saying when you see a tweet like that? Because I look at it and I go, okay, that's, to me, that just looks like an unintelligent tweet to try to get clicks. That's what I see. But I don't know him. I'm not in that world.
It may be a yes and. But look at American Reformer. That's what I'll say. Look at the types of writings that are happening in American Reformer.
I've only glanced over it. I'll have to go look and take a hard look at it.
It's not all that, but it's there, right? Timon Klein writing an article called Hail Caesar, where he was generally positive on Stephen Wolfe's Christian Prince, who, in my book, I show the parallels to Francisco Franco, El Caudillo, with the Christian Prince. It's very, very similar in the way that he writes it. That Spanish propaganda wrote about him as he's like this great Christian savior. They commissioned Stephen Wolfe just last week it published last week to write an article that's saying true hospitality is about deporting people who are not ethnically and culturally similar to you. Right.
That was on New Reformer?
As was American Reformer.
Or American Reformer?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So the tone of conversation, and they're positioning themselves. If Job Abbotoy is that dumb, he's working for the wrong. He's running. He's the executive director of the wrong thing because they're positioning themselves as intellectuals.
Maybe I shouldn't have said dumb. I'm saying like a dumb decision, as in this. Because here's what I feel like. I go through Twitter, and 80% of it is just people tweeting things for shock value. I just see people going, oh, I'm going to tweet that because that's going to get a conversation started. That's how people make careers now. Like that's how unfortunately, it's like how pastors are doing this, scholars, historians, theologians. It's like, let's say something way out there, and then if we get called on it, oh, well, this is what I really meant, and I'll pull it in a little bit. But it got my million reshares is what I wanted. And now, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like I'm just surrounded by that to where no one's really speaking maybe you would argue they are saying exactly what they believe. But to me, I go, that's like saying a round square. Like, you can't say Protestant Franco. You can't say Christian Mussolini. You can't say we need a Christ-like Hitler. Like, they're opposites.
There's a factor in this, and that is that Franco and also Augusto Pinochet are the two authoritarians that guys who might want a Christian Mussolini, or guys like you watch the people who talk about this and have been talking about it for a long time. The guy who knows that he comes out and says, yeah, I want a Mussolini, he's going to get shot down. Franco and Pinochet are kind of like the safe options, right? So I'm not saying that's what Josh Abatoy did, but I'm saying that is a cofactor as somebody.
He doesn't sound very safe from what you're telling me. Like I said, I don't know much about him, but from his history.
Next, look at Pinochet, right? Rhett Koppel came out. If you know who he is, he's a outspoken Christian nationalist online. Yeah. He came out, and there was that meme, my political leanings in 2016 versus 2023. His 2023 was Pinochet, right? Pinochet, and if you see the meme of helicopter rides, it's because he threw and here we go back to he stopped the commies. He threw the communists out of helicopters. Yeah. Well, he threw anybody who was against him out of a helicopter, right? Not just the commies, man.
Yeah.
And so this theme, it's like this fool me once kind of thing, right? Like, if you see it over and over and over, and I'm just basically, looking at the people at the forefront of this movement online, and it's a small movement,
right?
But it just happens to sit at the absolute center of the Venn diagram of my interests, which is Reformed theology and authoritarian nationalism.
Right.
So of course I'm obsessed with it.
Right.
But when you look at this movement, it's everywhere. We've right now just touched the tip of the iceberg, dude.
Yeah.
Like there's people and movers and shakers that we haven't even brought up that are also engaged in this stuff.
Yeah. So as we finish this out,
what
is that the kind of stuff that is going to be in your book when it is finished?
My book is.
Give us like a couple minute overview of what you're going to discuss in there.
Sure, man. So really, it is a section by section refutation of Stephen Wolfe's book.
Okay.
So I do talk about I draw from what Stephen Wolfe wrote elsewhere to bring context.
Okay.
Right to the book, but it is essentially I do prove. Mm-hmm. That his theory, like I said at the top, is mostly secular-driven, authoritarian, and ethno-nationalism, right? Wrapped in this really bad definition of natural law, where natural law is anything I find expedient for my cause. And then on top of it, we're going to bake in two kingdoms theology and some idea of having, these two different kingdoms that run the government, even though when you see it, he's actually very integralist.
Baptist and Presbyterian. Sorry.
No, they have loser theology, the Baptists, if you remember.
I love my fellow Baptists.
You got one sitting next to you.
That's what I mean.
But really, he really is integralist, right? In his things. You'll see that in the book. I lay that out. And just proving that that's what this is, right? It's not a Christian book. It's a book of authoritarian political theory that kind of has Christian, quote unquote, grafted on.
Yeah. So final word, if you have someone, a listener out there, or someone comes up to you, they're a believer, they go, I've heard some stuff about this Christian nationalism stuff. What do you think? Or what should I believe? Like, what are you telling someone who has a clean slate, who's coming to this, let's say in 2023, they don't know much about it? What are you telling them? Do your research, ignore it altogether, don't get involved, read the Bible? Like
the last one, absolutely. Read your Bible.
Yeah.
Trust in Christ.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
Don't put your treasure in heaven.
Yeah.
These guys are putting all their treasure in earth.
Yeah.
And what kind of society I can get into? Don't go so hardcore on the post mill that you forget that you're going to have treasure in heaven.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to say. Trust in Christ.
Yeah.
Right? And trust that he's going to see all of us through this.
Yeah. That's good. I think we should end it right there because I think that's a pretty good.
Cool, man.
That's the message. Trust in Christ. Guys, thanks so much for listening to another episode of Dead Men Walking Podcast. Blake, thanks for stopping by, man. Anytime you're in town, come on. And when that book comes out, come back on. We want to discuss it because I think it's a very interesting book.
Sound good.
I don't think there's anyone that I know of or anything out there quite like what you're describing and how you're going to answer that book. So I'd be very interested to see how it does too once you get it out to the public. And even if you're self-publishing, man, I think there's going to be people that are going to want to read it.
I hope so.
Especially, I can definitely tell you're interested in that subject and very passionate about it. So, guys, thanks for listening to another episode. As always, we appreciate you. We appreciate the feedback. We appreciate you sharing, telling a friend, all that good stuff. And as always, guys, chief end of man, to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. God bless. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Dead Men Walking Podcast for full video podcast episodes and clips, or email us at deadmenwalkingpodcast@gmail.com.
None your business.